What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of After Hours. You've got me, Jamie, and Craig here. You'll notice Garrett is not here. He's home taking care of some sick kids. I guess he's got a sick household, so he's taking care of them. So Craig and I are going to pick up the slack. We're going to talk a little bit about the Chargers 24-22 loss to the Bills, kind of do a brief synopsis of what happened in the game there, some things that we saw that we liked and that we didn't like. And then we're going to kind of go off the map a little bit. We're going to get away from the game and we're going to talk about things that we think the next Chargers regime needs to focus on fixing in the building and on the field. And we're going to get there by starting with a discussion of some insights that have come out, some revelations that have come out with regard to how the Chargers operate and some problems they have in the building. To use that as a jumping off point to talk about things that we think the team needs to fix. So it's going to be kind of an in-depth breakdown of not so much players and schemes, but more talking about big picture characteristics, traits, qualities that we think the team needs to be looking for, not just in their general manager and their head coach, but also in their players moving forward. So Craig, why don't you go ahead and get us started? Let's talk a little bit about the game. Why don't you give me a couple of your biggest takeaways from tonight's one-score loss to the Bills?
Well, first and foremost, it was entertaining, so I guess we have to be appreciative of that. If we're going to watch a Chargers team that's down a bunch of its more prolific or most prolific players, then you can only hope for efforts like the one we saw tonight. And overall, I think collectively, even in the loss, because I don't think anyone expected the game to be this close, that they all rallied together. They definitely played for Give Smith, and let's start with him first and foremost. He looked totally comfortable in that role. He didn't seem like the game was too big for him at any point. You can tell he's someone who's been around the league for quite some time, and it looks like he was prepared to do what he needed to do tonight. He looked extremely comfortable, and the guys seemed like they were in sync with him. Nothing looked disorganized on the sidelines as far as getting calls in and out. I mean, there were instances offensively where there were a few penalties due to motion, things of that nature, guys not lined up the way that they needed to be. But for the most part, the operation was pretty seamless. And as far as the play on the field, offensively, they looked a lot more aggressive than what we've seen here in the last few weeks under Kellen Moore. And I mean, I guess we can ask a little bit about how much of that has to do with Brandon Staley's influence on the offense, but they weren't nearly as conservative. You saw some plays attempts being made down the field to stretch the defense, and they were really operating at each level of the field. You were talking about those into the flat to Eckler, working the intermediate portion of the field with QJ, who also got a bunch of looks tonight. He seemed to be a focus, and down the field to him as well. Also to other guys contributing. Alex Erickson towards the end of the game making a couple of key plays. You saw Josh Palmer making some clutch catches. Austin Eckler, again, ran really hard tonight. Team looked like they were energized, and they showed up to play against a tough opponent who's in the midst or in the hunt for a playoff spot. They absolutely have not quit on the season. Even the defense showed up pretty much well earlier. They did in the game, but towards the end of it, there were some misses here and there. But I mean, the defense is only but so good at this point. There are some guys that probably won't be around next season just because they technically shouldn't be starters on teams right now. But for the most part, they seem cohesive. Communication looked fine. There were some misses here and there as far as just assignment and guys just not trusting what they were seeing. But overall, I like the effort that I saw in general. And again, like I said before, I can't think of much more that we could have asked for from this team under the current circumstances. We were probably all looking for them to get blown out, but that wasn't the case. So happy about that.
Yeah, I thought, one of my big takeaways was it seemed like they were going out of their way to put pretty much everybody in a position to succeed. They were playing to everybody's strengths on both sides of the ball. We saw Derwin playing closer to the line of scrimmage. When he was in coverage, it was generally in the slot. We saw some twists up front, some blitzes up front. They were very aggressive on third and long, trying to get to Josh Allen. On offense, we saw, jet sweeps for Darius Davis and for QJ. They tried to get QJ the ball in the intermediate part of the field. They took a couple deep shots with him. We saw intermediate and deep shots with Josh Palmer. We saw the underneath stuff like you mentioned with Eckler. They got Stick on the move out of the pocket quite a bit, let him kind of simplify things by reading half the field. A couple of real nice plays where he'd roll one way and throw back across the other for a chunk play. Um, it just seemed like for the first time, maybe all season, they had a really good handle on what people do well, and they were trying to accentuate that in the game plan, where we haven't really seen that from Kellen Moore for most of the season. And I'm not entirely sure why it took Justin Herbert being out for the rest of the year to get to that point, but it just kind of seemed like they threw the kitchen sink at the Bills, and it worked. The offense wasn't great, but they caught them off guard a couple times. They had some real nice drives. They put some points on the board. They took advantage of opportunities to kick field goals to stay in the game, and they just kind of let everybody play. And it just seemed like guys' minds were freer and they were more relaxed and they were making more plays. So I thought that was a really encouraging thing in terms of GIF and Derek Ansley specifically talking about, there was talk before the game about how Ansley approached the defense and said, "What do you guys want to do?" And he built the game plan around what they wanted to do, and they had success doing that. So, there's something to be said for simplifying and just letting guys go out and play the game that they love, the game that they play so well, and they got some solid results out of it.
The one thing I wanted to speak to that was a tell for me after the sudden change turnover on the muff punt, or the forced fumble on the punt, should I say. What I was looking for was what the first offensive play was going to be. And they went for a chunk play right away. And that's not something that we've been seeing on sudden change turnovers recently. You've been seeing them be extremely conservative, typically running the ball right after, but not on this one. It looks like they were trying to set up a shot play, just like you were speaking to, with Stick rolling out to the right, throwing back to his left. I don't think whatever he was looking for on the opposite side of the field came open, so he threw it to his second read, but they at least made the attempt, which is more than what we've been seeing recently. So it looks like they're going out of their way to do things very differently.
Yeah, and it'd be nice, some of those plays with Stick on the move. It'd be nice to get that, out of Justin when he's healthy. They didn't do as much of that with him as we would have liked. We also saw a couple of RPOs tried with Stick keeping the ball and getting big chunks on the ground. Again, things that I thought they would do more of with Herbert coming into the season, and it just didn't come to fruition for whatever reason. Kind of wondering now at this point, we've heard Staley talk about wanting to mimic what other offenses have had success doing, wanting to mimic things like that stretch or outside zone running game that the Rams use so well, and running off of play action and things like that. Maybe he was too caught up in mimicking what other people were doing and not paying enough attention to what his guys do well. And for whatever reason, as soon as he's gone, you see a complete shift, and they're more creative, they're more aggressive. They're doing things to help Stick. He's not static in the pocket. He's not standing there patting the ball. And these are all things they could have been doing for weeks with Justin Herbert and never really tried to do. So good on them for trying them. Would have liked to see more of it earlier in the season, but again, maybe that has a lot to do with Staley's thumb, his fingerprint on things, not letting them do those things.
Stick looked really comfortable. We mentioned them doing things that put him into a position to succeed. You saw him make some really good throws from the pocket that we haven't seen consistently from him. But I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the protection was also pretty good tonight. I mean, there were a few lapses here and there, but nowhere near what we probably expected to happen. I personally thought it was going to be a bloodbath, but wasn't the case. The line held up pretty well as far as what they did in the running game. Not great, but still there was a commitment to downhill running. I saw a lot of power being run. And again, it's just weird for all these things that we've asked for weeks to come to fruition in a game that's technically meaningless, but also it shows that the coaching staff and the guys that ran things now clearly understood what worked. So the question is, why wasn't it happening previously? But, it's over and done with, moving forward, and we'll just have to see what the last couple of games look like. But I feel like we can get a general idea of the direction it's going in. And really tells you a lot about what may have been happening prior to some of those firings last week.
Yeah, I also you mentioned the defensive line. I thought the defensive line did a good job too. They held up really well. They defended the run pretty well. They got a lot of pressure on Allen. We saw 2 spies on Allen, which is something we're not accustomed to seeing from the Chargers. Sometimes you get one. I don't recall them ever having 2, but they kept both linebackers in quite a bit to spy, and it did a good job of keeping Allen in the pocket and forcing him to throw the ball. But the team as a whole, I thought both lines were much more physical than they have been in a while, particularly more so than they were last week. And that is what I think kept them in the game and gave them an opportunity to win that game. Of course, it comes out like most one-score games do for the Chargers. They win the turnover battle. They win time of possession. They do pretty much everything right except for winning the game, which is just what the Chargers do, unfortunately. But they gave themselves a chance when they really probably realistically shouldn't have had a chance to win that game. So credit to them for coming out and fighting hard, showing a lot of heart, playing much harder for Gift Smith than they did for Brandon Staley, particularly last week, which isn't saying a whole lot. But I thought as a whole, they played really hard and showed a lot of fire and desire to win that game, which is not something they showed last week, and they've been struggling with that for most of the last few weeks. So good on those guys for stepping up and playing as well as they did and giving themselves a chance to win.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess we would be remiss to not mention Cameron Dicker. That kid's special. It looks like the Chargers finally have a cure for what's ailed them in the past. We've been without, well, take that back. A couple of kickers have gone on to have success. They haven't stuck around with the Chargers very long. They couldn't really find their way, but I think it goes to show you everything that Ryan Fickens meant to this team. The coverage team is tremendous. Even when they lose guys, they can plug in the next guy and they're still operating at a very, very high level. Darius Davis has to work on fielding those punts and kicks. I mean, it was kind of a knock on him coming out of college as well. But overall, the special teams is very good. And again, like I mentioned before, Cameron Dicker being someone that the Chargers have been very fortunate to find. And for the foreseeable future, they have a kicker, and that is no longer an issue. So something else to be very grateful for.
For really the first time since the end of the AJ Smith area. Yeah. First time in a while, 10 years at least. Well, more than that.
Yeah.
11, 12 years. Been a long time. Maybe Nick Novak was the last semi-reliable kicker they had after Kading.
Probably, yeah.
So, like I said earlier, we're not going to spend too much time talking about the game tonight. It is what it is. We kind of hit on the finer points. I do want to spend some time talking about some things that we learned about how the team operates over the last week or so since Brandon Staley got fired. And we're going to do that by talking about a podcast that came out last Saturday actually, I think it came out on Friday when Staley got fired. I think Staley was fired during the show, actually. And then we're going to talk about an article that was written by ESPN writer Chris Rim yesterday about the team. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about an article that Papa wrote as well about John Spanos' media session with the team, or with the media on Monday, I believe it was. So we're going to start with a discussion of the General Manager podcast, which is an athletic podcast with Randy Mueller, who was a longtime employee of the Chargers, a longtime scout, GM, football operations executive, who spent 10 years with the Chargers. He was with the Chargers from 2008 to 2018. So he was here for the best of times at AJ Smith's peak. And then he overlapped when John Spanos became the president of operations in 2015. So he spent 3 seasons with John Spanos running the show. So he kind of had some insight, and I wanted to play some sound, but I had a hard time getting it to work. So instead of playing the sound, I'm going to summarize kind of what he talked about on a point-by-point basis, and then we'll kind of kick it around and talk a little bit about kind of how that plays into how we perceive things and some things a team needs to focus on, and then we'll talk about Chris Rim's article. So we're going to start first. The first thing that kind of stood out to me was, and it was a quick point, Randy was talking about how the team worked towards the end of his time when John Spanos became the president of football operations, and he was talking about specifically the power structure, who reports to whom, and who's making the decisions. And we know, from John Spanos's media session on Monday, he talked about how he's involved in the day to day. He was talking to Brandon Staley, he was talking to Tom Telesco on a daily basis, and he deemed himself as being, quote, very involved. He says he wasn't telling them what plays to run or which players to play or anything like that. He wasn't interfering with like game day decisions. But he was very involved in personnel decisions. Those are his own words. And Randy Mueller kind of backs that up. He says that when he was there, the reporting structure was Tom Telesco, the coach reporting to Tom Telesco, and John Spanos, with John Spanos being the head executive on the football side. So, and there's been some debate about that. How involved is Spanos? Is he a figurehead? Is he making decisions? Are we giving him too much credit for the decision making and for things that are going wrong with the team? And I think, we talked about a lot about accountability with this team, and this is, I think, going to be a key point with the team. Is there's a general lack of accountability in the front office and on the field, and I think this setup kind of reflects that. While John is the owner's son, the whole operation failed, yet only two of the three guys got fired, and John still has a job. So, Craig, talk to me a little bit about how you feel about hearing our thoughts about how the operation is run, and your thoughts on kind of accountability within the organization, and how maybe a lack of accountability in the front office might be carrying over onto the field.
Well, first and foremost, it still very much so feels to me like John Spanos is the specter that kind of hovers over everything. And though he may not be involved or wasn't involved in, say, like, a lot of the on-field scenarios, having say so in personnel speaks to a lot of some of the situations that we've seen here in the past that don't really add up. Guys that are continuing to see the field that probably shouldn't, having players that have outperformed others, and for some reason those guys only getting a short period of time on the field for whatever that reason is. Maybe it was for an injury and another guy comes back, and the guy who gets the snaps to replace him you don't see very much of anymore going forward. Weird things like that. But overall, when we're talking about just the key word here being accountability, when you have a family run organization operation where, you've got an owner who allows his children to kind of have their way in the front office and maneuver, there is going to be a lack of accountability there because, basically letting the inmates run the asylum. If Dean isn't going to rule with the iron fist and he kind of stays back and allows his kids to run things, then they can do things as they see fit. And when things don't go well, is Dean going to come down on his kids, or is Dean expecting results to come from somewhere? Somebody's head has to fly. And from what it sounds like, based on what we were hearing and a lot of this conversation from this podcast, and Mueller really made some points that kind of an indictment on the way that the franchise has been run. What it sounds like is that there is no accountability with upper management and ownership. Essentially, they make the hires, GM, head coach. If things don't go right, heads have to roll. Starts at the bottom, probably coaching staff, and then it goes up to head coach, and now finally general manager. But before, it just seemed like maybe there was a relationship thing there with Tom Telesco and the Spanos family, which allowed him to stick around much longer than he probably should have. But if from the top, you're not going to have the type of accountability necessary to have a successful program, or, because it starts there. If you have consistent dysfunction and the common denominator are the people at the top and everything else under it consistently changes, then it pretty much tells you where the problem really lies. And for the first time now, and we'll get to this later on, you're starting to hear them, specifically Dean, take accountability for what hasn't been working to a degree. And so maybe now you'll start to see some change. But based on what I heard from this podcast and other things that, again, we will discuss, it pretty much backs up everything that we believed, if not reinforces it.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, and accountability is going to be kind of a recurring theme as we're talking about things that the team is lacking or needs to focus on moving forward. I think it's something that after watching them get blown out by the Raiders last week and just watching guys continually make the same mistakes over and over and over again, and then thinking about, Staley simplifying things, having them work, and then going right back to a system that was too complicated that he knew his guys couldn't execute, and never really owning those mistakes, that stubbornness, that belief in himself to make it work. I think accountability is something that is really hurting this team at all levels, in the front office, on the practice field, in the games, on the sideline. There doesn't seem to be any accountability from coaches, players, executives, any of it. And like you said, when it continues to happen, regardless of the general manager, regardless of the head coach, you kind of start to see where the problem lies. And the problem lies in John Spanos. And there's really a couple ways to fix that, right? One is fire John Spanos, but we know that's not going to happen. So the other way, which is I think the way that they're at least considering going at this point, is finding a head coach and letting that guy kind of run the shop and make the decisions. And I think that's where they're headed. It's based on all the quotes they've been making, based on things that people are saying about them being willing to give up power and pay for a head coach. It seems like they're going down that path. So hopefully that's something that they fix. But it's something that they really have to focus on, because when your best players, when Derwin's not giving max effort in a blowout game, when guys are continually committing stupid penalties and blowing coverages and dropping balls and not getting lined up properly, it just shows that nobody's buying in, and you're not getting that level of accountability where guys are calling each other out. The coaches aren't doing it, or they're doing it and the players don't care. And that's a huge problem. So accountability is something they've definitely got to work on. It's something they've got to focus on moving forward, holding everybody accountable. And then another quote that I wanted to bring up that I thought was interesting was Randy Mueller was talking about his 10 years with the Chargers. And he was talking about his role, which he was the national scout. He openly on his podcast, he referred to his role as a quote, trumped up title. He said he was the national scout. I had a trumped up title. And basically what he said was, it was just a really hard organization to work for. We were always behind the 8 ball. We never got ahead. I felt like we never did enough to fix the problems that we had in the building. Nobody was asking difficult questions. Nobody was addressing difficult problems. There were no hard conversations being had. He actually said, he kind of caught himself, but he basically said he felt like he wasted 10 years working for the Chargers, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. He went on to work for other teams. He had a lot of success, and his whole thing was, I was the national scout, and I had no say, and I was always on the outside looking in on all the difficult conversations. And that to me is part of that dysfunction that we keep talking about, right? And John Spanos was part of that at the end, his last 3 years. He was actually the vice president of football operations from 2013 to 2015, and then he became the president of football operations in 2015 and remains in that role now. So, I mean, what are your thoughts, Craig, on a guy who spent 10 years with the organization talking about it being a waste of 10 years, and you hear him talking about how they were always behind the 8 ball and he never felt like they did enough to get ahead?
It was really jarring to hear him basically start off the conversation, and you immediately realize that he was trying to parse his words. He was attempting to be very careful to not, I guess, insult the organization. But there's only so many ways that you can describe a place that is so inept to where it sounds, friendly and chipper. It's not really all that possible. And to basically come out and say, because he did say, he says, I didn't want to call it a wasted 10 years, but essentially what he's implying here is that he was stagnant for a decade. He watched the team not move forward consistently day in and day out, repeat the same activities, the front office not making the proper moves, having the hard conversations. I mean, if you're going to walk on eggshells in a business that is results oriented like this, I don't know exactly where you expect to go, but I can't imagine being somewhere for the, better part of a decade and essentially not really having, and he mentioned this as well. I think I don't want to cross over into other quotes too much, but it kind of leads into it, like not having a single conversation with anyone above him about football of any consequence whatsoever. Like that is amazing to me. It almost feels as if after having left this role to move forward, and I mean he has had success elsewhere. It feels like it was a weight lifted off of his shoulders to finally be free of the organization and the rut that he apparently was in. But being a part of successful organizations and seeing how they operate and looking back at the time he spent with the Chargers, I'm sure he can speak directly to, and did here, about why things weren't working there. And he seems like he has a very, very difficult time seeing a path forward where they don't continue to operate as they have, even with the things that have been said. So, I mean, ultimately, I think what it boils down to is we now have the words of someone who understood the operation intimately, and we don't have to look at it really as conjecture. It's someone who had that experience every single day for 10 years, and he spoke to it, I'd say, as well as he could without, like I mentioned before, it being insulting. But it just, again, backs up everything that we've believed about how it's run, very mom and pop like. And it's really unfortunate that it's taken this long to get to this point. But if that level of embarrassment is what we needed to get to in order for the organization to make a significant change, then I mean, great. I'm just happy we're here now. And hopefully that means we'll see significant change moving forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. I was going to bring it up. He referred to the operation as mom and pop.
Mm.
He said, you know, Dean's son John runs football operations. His other son Alex runs marketing. It's very much a mom and pop shop. Basically, the team is there to employ Dean's family. It's pretty
He
much what he
said
said.
it was much like the Saints organization, which I know a
He
little
did
bit
compare
about.
them to the
The
Saints.
Bensons.
Yep.
Right. Yep. The
Yep. It was he
Bensons.
directly. Yep.
Yeah. The Bensons run it similarly, but they've done it with more success because they're not as rigid as the Chargers are. So even though it is, again, very mom and popish, the organization as a whole is willing to do what's necessary to succeed, almost to a fault. And sometimes they'll put themselves in holes in doing it, and it takes them a while to recover, but they still make the attempt and necessary changes. So I would say personally, from what I know, those are the differences between the two.
Yeah. So we talked about the mom and pop thing, and then you alluded to the other quote, one of the other quotes I was going to bring up, which was Randy said he was there for 10 years and had no voice whatsoever, no say in what was happening as the national scout. And he directly said, um, the direct quote was, I was there for 10 years and I never had a conversation about football of any consequence with anybody above me in the pecking order, was pretty much the direct quote, which is mind-blowing that you have somebody who's in charge of your scouting department and he can say, I never had a conversation of any consequence with anybody ahead of me in the pecking order. Like, that's just, granted, he's traveling a lot, right? He's on the road probably 9 months out of the year, 8 months out of the year, whatever it is. But even in the draft room, even when they're talking free agents, no say. Nobody asked him to contribute. Nobody asked his opinion. And he actually said, I think that was the way they wanted it. It's like he was, his co-host kind of laughed in shock of like, how can you be there and never have a conversation of consequence? And he was like, that people don't believe me when I say it, but that's just the way it is. And I think that's exactly the way they wanted it. They didn't want people questioning them. They didn't want people challenging them. They didn't want to have those difficult conversations. But just crazy that somebody could have a position that high up in a football or an NFL organization and never have a meaningful conversation about football. It's nuts to even
It
think
feels
about.
almost like an exaggeration. I mean, I'm not saying that he is, but it's so hard to grasp the idea of someone with that role, even though he called it trumped up, to still be someone that's out in the field, scouting players, literally the guy that you want to be in conversation with regard to building your team and getting the right type of players in your system. To say that, and you're talking about the pecking order. I mean, is he saying directly that he never spoke with Tom Telesco about this? Because that seems, how does that even function properly? Like if Telesco is in charge of signing these players, he has to speak with scouting to some degree. I mean, there has to be some sort of gathering of the minds. But if you're saying that you didn't have any conversation whatsoever with anyone above you, that seems weird to me. Again, not saying the guy's lying, but I can completely understand him not speaking to John Spanos because we hardly ever see John Spanos. So I'm not shocked if people in the building don't see John Spanos. But just in general, for an entire decade to have that be the case and it be the way that they literally carved it out, have it be that the operation be that way, I don't know. They don't want anyone to give their opinion or maybe tell them a difference of opinion, should I say. It seemed like John and Tom, whatever that relationship was, kind of had their side conversations and they made those decisions amongst themselves. And they didn't want anyone to interject and give an opinion that might lend to the opposite of what they thought, because they wanted to take all the credit for, specifically John. We know that, go look at the bio. He absolutely wants the credit for everything that the team has success in. We're talking about players and other achievements. So again, I'm not completely mind blown by the fact that there was this separation. There was clear segregation in certain areas, but I find it really hard to believe that there were no interactions with the role that he had and the general manager. It just seems off.
Yeah, it is hard to believe. And like I said, his co-host asked him how it worked. And he basically was like, it was just a really hard place to work. And that was just how they operated. And then a couple other things that struck me. One was Randy Mueller mentioned that there is kind of an organizational acceptance of mediocrity, that nobody in that building, coach, GM, executive, player, nobody is demanding more of anybody in that building. That there's kind of an overriding acceptance of the idea of, hey, I'm going to show up, I'm going to get my paycheck, and I'm going to, kind of go through the motions in the game, and that's kind of the way it is. And that nobody's asking more of anybody in that regard, which is kind of crazy to me. He actually used the phrase, there is a mindset of collect my check and keep moving. And he said that they have been accepting mediocrity from the day they left their facility in San Diego and moved in LA as what he called the JV team in the facility in LA, that they've been comfortable and accepting of mediocrity from that moment, which is, again, pretty mind-blowing if true, that you spend all that money to move to LA, you're in this huge market, you have to succeed to be taken seriously. And at the time, the Rams were at the peak of their game, and you're okay with mediocrity and nobody's demanding more. He said he doesn't think they want that demanding voice in the building. Now, it's, from what we've been hearing, it sounds like that's shifting. They did it with Marty. They did it with Bobby Ross. They were there for a short time. They kind of burned hot and left. And it seems like they're heading in that direction now. But it kind of explains a lot when you put it in the context of watching the Raiders game last week and watching these guys just completely roll over and die on national television. And you watch them make the same mistakes week after week after week. And it goes back to accountability, but it also goes back to, as much as the Spanos talk about wanting to win, is it as important as they say it is? If these guys, if they're okay with these guys just rolling out there and rolling over and being mediocre or worse, how serious are they as a franchise, and are they really serious about winning?
Well, I was going to say, so we understand that there's a very clear hierarchy, and the way that they look down from their perches is as if everyone else are just worker bees. And then on top of that, they seem very non-confrontational. In a business like this, again, that's results oriented, you can't just avoid, these tough conversations, because especially if you're not being successful. The Chargers have, literally been walking in mediocrity here for years. They have a tendency to be middling. It's been one of the most frustrating things about being a fan of this team, is watching them have the requisite talent and most years or some years, especially recently, and just see them teeter around looking like they can be better and maybe only being a step or two away and just never reaching that peak. When you're talking about players rolling over like they did last week, I can explain how that happens. And they're actually telling us here. When there's a disconnect between, what you want and what ownership wants in the front office, and there's no in between, no conversation, no coming together for one general cause, then it's hard to have a sense of pride in it because you won't feel a stake in that place. Like, what you do doesn't really matter. You're there to perform a task, and no one really cares about how you feel about the situation or what you care to contribute to it, or whether or not what it means to you. You're just there to serve a purpose. And so if you've got people just collecting checks, then no one has a vested interest in everything as a whole. Talking about it from like a company aspect. If a team collectively is working together for one goal, everyone should respect each other's opinions. Now, of course, there is a hierarchy and you have to respect that, but having kind of these closed door policies typically don't result in great outcomes. When you have something like a football team where there's so many contributing factors and people who play key roles. So everyone basically bands together and holds hands in these scenarios, and that's what helps you get towards the common goal. But again, it's very hard to take pride in something when you feel like technically you don't have a voice in it and you're just there to follow rules and collect a check. So there's really no real love for it. It probably saps some of your dedication and love and desire to work to be better. I can understand maybe that caused some guys to quit. They're to the point to where they feel like what they're dealing with week after week is based on the fact that the person that they're following won't adapt and won't take accountability. So why should they feel the need to have to be accountable for what they're doing? So just kind of a trickle down effect.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think for some of these guys that have been here for a while, they continue to see the same players make the same mistakes. They continue to see the team lose the same way. Coaches in over their heads, not making adjustments, not willing to make adjustments. And after a while, it's just kind of like, well, if they're not going to make adjustments, why should I?
Well,
I'm getting paid either way. So I'll go get my check and I'll do what I can, but we're probably going to lose anyway. It just seems like there are some things in that locker room that are rotten. We've talked about the lack of accountability. I think, and there's something else that I think we need to talk about too, which is basic professionalism. Even you can even tie it into some level to maturity and leadership, and that is, we've heard former players when they leave talk about how it's hard to get their teammates to watch film. You can't make grown men sit down and watch film. You can let them know what's going on. You can invite them to join you, but they may or may not do it depending on how serious they are about their jobs. Eric Weddle talked about that before he left. And I have my own thoughts on Eric Weddle, but this is now, it seemed like Khalil Mack talked about that a little bit last week. It just seems like it's something that's permeating through the locker room, that guys are not doing their homework. They're not prepared for games. They don't know what to expect or how to react when things happen. Maybe they're watching the film in the meeting room, but they're not watching film on their own. They're not preparing themselves on their own. And that's a professionalism thing. That is a maturity thing of taking some pride in what you do and putting that extra work in to get ready so you can eliminate those mistakes that you continue to make over and over and over again. So now I've lost my train of thought. I just feel like they really need to do a better job of evaluating the character of the players that they're bringing in. They have a lot of guys that are making a lot of money who don't seem to be doing a whole lot of leading. They don't seem to be setting the example. Some of their highest paid players are the most guilty of making dumb mistakes in games. Whether it's personal fouls or busted coverages or missed assignments or whatever the case may be, these guys are making the same mistakes over and over again, and they're not coming off the field. So then what's the incentive of the younger guys to take that next step if those guys are not coming off the field, and they're allowed to continue making those mistakes. And um, I just really think they need to do a better job evaluating the character of the players, because it just seems like they're coming up short in that regard in terms of finding the right guys to fit in the locker room and hold each other accountable.
Leadership is very important. Again, coaching is a huge deal. But some coaches have certain styles that may not necessarily lend to what you think would yield a successful NFL team. Like you could look at the soft-spoken guys like Tony Dungy. Um, just doesn't come across as one of those guys that players will maybe want to run through a wall for, but they respected him. What they did have were other leaders on the team that people could look for or look to for that sort of inspiration and motivation and keeping players in line. And I'm sure they stepped up and probably even talked to Dungy about holding those roles, or he assigned that to them to be those players, because with football being a collision sport, you kind of have to have one of those general types, someone that'll lead you in a bit more of an aggressive way. And if it's not, say for instance, the coach, you need the players that'll be able to do it. You mentioned some of the players that are the highest paid that aren't necessarily leaders. We know who we're talking about here. You got your Joey Bosa's, who he makes, when we're talking about on-field mistakes, is one thing, and being penalized for actual play, but then just doing things flying off the handle out of anger, not being able to control your emotions, that's not something that you can have as a leader. You're looking at the guys under you. What do you expect them to be when they see you slam your helmet on the field and your coach pick the helmet up and hand it to you? What sort of example do you think that sets for the rest of the team? What sort of precedent do you think you're setting? Derwin has seemed to be a vocal leader, but he's having his struggles recently with his play on the field, and a lot of that has to do with being put in position to where he's not succeeding. And I think it has kind of probably weighed on him mentally a bit. So you're looking at the effect it's had on him on the field. I can't speak to whether or not it's changed what he's been as a leader. I've always, from what I've seen, whether it's been videos or on the field, the way he's getting the guys together, yelling, screaming, getting guys together on the sidelines, he seems like he's still trying to be that guy. But that's a lot to have to carry. Being a leader, struggling on the field, that's probably the yin and yang, trying to get himself together there mentally to be all that he needs to be on the field and still be a leader. So I can understand that maybe affecting your game a bit. And, just some of the other guys that are the higher paid players like Keenan, I feel like Keenan is probably very well loved amongst that locker room and guys on that team. What his overall effect is on the team, not totally sure, because what we also found out was that there seems to be sort of a separation between offense and defense. So don't really know how much leadership extends across the team as a whole, or if there's just leadership in certain pockets to certain position groups, or but there just seems to be no real cohesiveness with the team, and there is a very real lack of professionalism, as you mentioned, just these core competencies that this team can't grasp. And the more you hear, the more these reports come out, the more you realize just how much dysfunction existed. And you almost have to wonder, how are they not worse sooner? And it just kind of plays up to the point to where they have some really, really talented players that have helped to keep them at least middling. But, for all intents and purposes, the foundation of this thing has all sorts of cracks in it. And they're going to have to tear it down to the studs. And I mean, like, not completely overhaul a roster or anything, but from a leadership standpoint, and bringing in a guy that can be the person that everyone can look to and help to lead them in the right direction moving forward.
Yeah, I think Derwin he's kind of been reduced to more of a hype man than a leader. A lot of talking, a lot of rah-rah, not really backing up his talk with his play on the field. I don't know how much of that is falling on deaf ears at this point. And we're going to talk about this article on ESPN here in a minute. And you've already alluded to part of the problem that they talked about, which was the division between offense and defense. And it really sounds like the whole team is divided in a lot of ways. So if Derwin is trying to be that leader, it doesn't sound like he's doing a very effective job of it if they're that divided in the locker room. So, and Keenan, I mean, he's openly criticized the team on Twitter when he's been out of games on multiple occasions in the last couple of years. So not really sure he's that leadership type. You need somebody to step up in that vein. I think you'd like it to be the quarterback. I don't know that Herbert is there yet in terms of his personality and being able to take that leadership mantle on. Lots of clips of him just sitting on the bench during the game today, kind of by himself. Doesn't seem like guys are drawn to him. You don't see him on the sideline pumping guys up. And that may not be part of his personality, but I do think they need to get more leadership out of Herbert. I think one of the big problems last week was outside of Khalil Mack, they didn't have anybody to fall back on when things started to go sideways. They couldn't fall back on the coach. They couldn't fall back on the quarterback. There was nobody there to fall back on and pull guys back and snap them out of it and get them playing hard again. There just wasn't. So
while you mentioned that, it makes me think like you spoke to something that's really telling about this team. If a guy who's only been here for 2 years has to be a core player when you have all these other guys that have been around for years, then what does that say about the leadership that you have on your team? It's sorely lacking. So to look at Khalil Mack as kind of being the North Star for the team we love Khalil, but that shouldn't be the case. He can be a leader, but he shouldn't really be the heart and soul. That's not the role he should be playing at 32, 33 years old, second year on the team, not knowing whether or not he's still going to be around next year.
And that's something that was mentioned in the article we're going to talk about. So, we can kind of go ahead and get into that now. But, one of the things, and I mentioned this, I think, on the mailbag show earlier in the week, at halftime, I was headed out to an appointment and listening on the radio, and they were interviewing whatever the girl's name on the sideline is on the radio. Michelle, I can't remember her name, but anyway, they were interviewing her and they were asking her what the mood was like on the sideline. And her response was, the team is split between people who have given up and people who are pissed. And Money and DJ asked, well, who's pissed and who's given up? And she said, well, the people that are pissed are Khalil Mack and Rashawn Slater and Gerald Everett and Easton Stick. That was it. Those are the 4 people she mentioned that were upset. So sounds like everybody else had pretty much given up. And it looked that way on the field. So that's not a real great look for an NFL team that they have 4 people on the team that are quote unquote leaders. And none of them have been on the team for more than 2 years. Well, Slater's in his 3rd year, but you get my point. I mean, nobody's rallying around Easton Stick. Slater was hurt all year last year. Mack is in his 2nd year with the team. Everett's in his 2nd year with the team. None of the longtime veterans are pissed off. None of them are smacking guys around and getting guys riled up and trying to get them back in the game. That's a huge red flag to me, a huge problem.
Yeah, for sure. Again, team just lacks solid foundational leadership, and that's going to be one of the jobs of whoever the new head coach is going to be. When he walks through that door, he has to establish who his guys are going to be, and they're going to be tasked with being kind of the pillars for which the team has to be supported by. So
we've got a couple tweets that we need to share real quick. First one is from Blazing Bolts. He says, we played better, but sucks that we lost on Christmas. Just wanted to show my support for the podcast. You guys are the best. Bolt the F up. Thank you, Blazing Bolts. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas to you. We appreciate the support. You've been super supportive since we started the super chat. So thank you for that. And happy holidays to everybody. We're glad you guys are here sharing this with us, even though we're in the midst of the holidays here.
Greatly appreciate it, folks.
And then one more. And this is from Charles Michael Sinclair. He says, confirmed, Staley was hated. And it certainly looks that way based on the difference in the way they looked last week and the way they look this week. Much more prepared, much more focused, playing with a lot more heart and intensity. It was a totally different squad this week than it was last week. So let's chat a little bit about this article that Chris Rim wrote for ESPN. There was a lot in it, but there were some, I think, kind of overarching issues that he pointed out. One of those issues, and you mentioned it, was the division. It sounded like the locker room was kind of divided between Staley guys and non-Staley guys. And there was a quote in the article that said basically it kind of felt like a fraternity. Either you were in the frat or you weren't in the frat. And basically you could tell who Staley liked and who he didn't like by who he wished happy birthday to during meetings, which is, I can't believe, in a room full of grown men who are making millions of dollars to play a game, I can't believe we're talking about birthday wishes. But let's throw that aside. I think that's kind of an ancillary point. The division of the team, the fact that there are Staley guys, there are non-Staley guys. There was also a lot of talk about offense versus defense and how the two groups didn't gel, they didn't hang out together. They were kind of off doing their own things. So, I mean, we both played team sports growing up. Craig, you did it at a higher level than I did. What do you make of that? A team that's that divided?
I mean, here's the way I look at it. During the summers and during training camps, you create the competition. And so if you're sectioned apart, that's one thing. Guys are getting together and growing their partnerships on their group, becoming more cohesive and building on their respective sides of the ball. Totally understand. It may even create a greater sense of competition, making it an offense versus defense thing. You stay on your side, we have ours, get all that. At the end of the day, once it's all said and done, once you're off of the field, you're a team. There's no reason why guys shouldn't be hanging out together. It shouldn't have anything to do with what side of the ball they play on, because you're all, like I mentioned before, you should be all striving to reach the same goal. Ultimately, to have guys so divided feels almost like someone created that rift. There's something there that's established. Someone has to cross over the table and say, hey, this is something that we need to do together. I know that they mentioned Khalil Mack extended the offer to come to the team dinners to offensive guys. And I mean, maybe not a lot of them went, or however that worked. But again, this is where having a core leader, someone who's been around for a while, makes all the difference in the world. That shouldn't have been on Khalil Mack's shoulders to try to have to make that happen. I'm glad that he did something. But collectively, just to the greater point, we're talking about just a team and division. There's no room for division in a team. Those two things can't coincide. So again, you can do things to where you can be competitive against one another and try to heighten up the level of competition by creating kind of that pseudo division when you're practicing against one another. When you're talking about you're together for one common goal and moving towards that throughout a physical season, there has to be some cohesion overall. And again, besides just having core leadership in the team, that's also a coaching issue. Now, I know a lot of people say that it shouldn't be up to the coach to make that happen, but part of a coach or being a coach is being able to coach or teach a group of guys to come together. And if Staley wasn't able to do that and it was left upon the players, then he failed in that role as well. So my personal opinion, just in my experiences, is the best teams that I've been a part of have been guys who were very close. To this day, like a lot of my teammates, I have very close relationships with. Like even guys, if I haven't talked to in a while, we could get together tomorrow and it'll be like nothing has ever changed. Some guys I haven't talked to in a few years, we could get on the phone, see each other, and tomorrow, and it would be like we picked up right where we left off. And that's because we built that camaraderie and that friendship. And we have a special bond because we were both trying to achieve the same thing. And I was playing for you, you were playing for me. And that's how teams work. If you don't have that, you're probably going to fail. So again, I'm not shocked when we hear about all these different things, all the different sections of the teams that weren't together and all the different areas that weren't, I guess, collectively working as one unit. It makes all the sense in the world how they are where they are now. And unfortunately, yes, it feels like there's a lot of work to do, which leads me to believe the Chargers understand that they can't go into this next coaching cycle and take another risk. They need someone who's solid to walk in and that can kind of pull this together rather quickly.
Yeah, I think they need some stability, and they need some maturity and an adult in the room. And that word keeps coming up, maturity. But you need somebody, basically, we've talked about it before, somebody who can, walk in, drop his stuff on the table and be like, this is how we're doing it because this is what works. And they haven't had that. I think that's where they need to go. It seems like that's where they're headed. I'm just wondering, in a locker room full of men. I mean, this isn't peewee football where you need to teach these guys how to come together. These guys have all been playing football their whole lives. You would think that they would understand the importance of being together and having those team functions and bonding and pulling for each other. It just seems like there's a lot of selfishness in this group. Guys who are there for their money, their numbers, their social media interactions, their Pro Bowl trips, whatever it is. It just doesn't seem like anybody's pulling in the same direction in terms of winning. They talk about winning. They say they want to win, but it just doesn't seem like they're playing together. It doesn't seem like there's any cohesiveness at all. So hopefully, whoever comes in, Jim Harbaugh, hopefully whoever comes in can pull that together. They can clean some of the problems out of the locker room because I really do think, I mentioned it earlier, I think they've got an issue with some of their star players. They're just not in it for everybody else. And maybe that's just how the current generation works to some extent, but it just seems like there's a lot of self-serving agendas on the team right now that need to be fixed. The other thing that came up, and this had more to do with Staley, was there was talk about when guys stopped listening to him. And it started after Jacksonville, which I guess now we know why, Daniel Popper spent so much time this year harping on the Jacksonville game. I still think to an extent too much once it became clear he wasn't going to get the answers he wanted, but that's a different story, a different time, a different subject for a different time. But I think what the article said was basically he came out of that game a historic blown lead, a game that they had well in hand. I mean, they basically played a perfect first half, and they could not have played a worse first half. And he said, hey, guys, these things happen. And the players felt like that was him not taking accountability and passing the buck onto them. And that was kind of a recurring theme in the article was players felt like he never accepted blame and he was always passing blame onto them. And I guess that kind of raises the question for me of, you want to hear the coach say, hey, I wasn't good enough today. My scheme wasn't good enough. I didn't do enough to get them ready. We weren't good enough this week, and that falls on me. You want to hear him say that publicly. But behind closed doors, it just seems like this is a group of players that doesn't like to be criticized. They don't like to be told when they're not doing something right. Because let's face it, we're not NFL coaches. None of us here are. But we can all watch the game and we can all see, we can identify a blown assignment, a busted coverage, whatever it might be. Defenders running into each other, a missed tackle for a big gain, running an interception out of the end zone that shouldn't be run out of the end zone. Whatever it might be, we can all identify these things with our quote unquote untrained eye. The coaches, part of their job is to tell the players when they're not doing things right. And again, coaches need to accept accountability and they need to be able to make adjustments. And some of that wasn't happening, and I totally get that. But are the players too sensitive if they feel like he's passing the buck onto them? Because a lot of this is on them for not executing. He could have put them in better positions to succeed, but they're still not getting the job done. And he's not on the field. So he can accept the blame publicly, but at some point, it's their fault too. Is that ridiculous? Is that unfair?
Well, no. See, I don't think it's that at all. I don't even think they're overly sensitive. The problem is Staley set himself up for failure by playing favorites because we don't know to what extent he's critical of everyone. We do know that he has guys that he goes out of his way to gush over. And I feel like what probably could have been happening is that the way that you criticize a Justin Herbert may not be the way that you criticize a Michael Davis. And all things being fair, it's not really about necessarily them being, I want to say, sensitive about it, not necessarily to them being critical. It's just like, hey, well, it's weird that you would come down on me about this, but give a pass to this with this player. So across the board, if people aren't performing, the criticism needs to be universal based on who did what. You can't pick and choose who you're going to praise and who you're going to give criticism to. And I think maybe that's where he set himself up for failure. And when you do the whole boys club, the whole frat thing, you're asking for it. And guys probably won't respond well to that based off of that. So they probably look at you a certain way already. It's like, okay, I'm not one of his guys. So I'm probably not going to take well to anything that he tells me. I don't like the way that he, talks to me, whereas he doesn't treat player X similarly. Again, it's not always about being treated the same. It's about being treated fairly. So I think probably more than likely, that would be the way that I would lean towards it. So I think, again, Staley definitely set himself up for failure in that regard. And it's hard to be overly critical of players if you're not going to, be the same throughout. You can't really play favorites as a coach. We know certain players get passes on things. I mean, if you're one of the better players, you're not going to have all of the same treatment as just, the last guy on the bench, number 53. You're not going to be that guy. You're not going to get that similar treatment. But there has to be some level of consistency across the board with regard to coaching. And I don't think Staley was doing that. The impression I get is that he wasn't. So if I'm wrong there, I'm wrong. But it just feels like maybe he wasn't being fair and balanced across the team.
Yeah, I mean that seems pretty clear based on the Staley guys versus non-Staley guys and the talk about either you're in the fraternity or you're not. It seems pretty clear that he wasn't treating everybody the same, and that he was playing favorites. And like you said, we've heard it in the way he talks about certain guys. And then the final point that I took from that article, and we've talked about this at length on our show, is the how complicated Staley made things, the defensive scheme in particular, how he wanted to stick to the way he did things because that's what got him there, which you can understand to a certain extent, but not realizing the guys couldn't carry things out. Trying to add a rule for every motion, every route, every formation, every little movement, giving guys too much to think about and locking them up on the field. And I think we've already seen the team kind of go away from that tonight, where it just seemed like they were letting guys play and they were much more effective and they played much better. So it's just interesting to hear that stuff called out from, albeit anonymous sources, which I'm not crazy about. If you're a professional athlete and you're going to talk about somebody, I think you should put your name on it personally. We do that here, but for whatever reason, athletes want to hide behind, the anonymous sources, which I think is chicken shit, but it is what it is. But what are your thoughts on Staley overcomplicating things and not being flexible enough to realize what the team did well and didn't do well?
Well, first of all, football is not a game where you can have paralysis by analysis. Plays are made and missed in split seconds. If you have a guy that has multiple things that he has to consider before he takes his first step, then even the most elite athletes don't have the type of recovery to make up for just that split second. Staley feels like he may have been emboldened to, almost enabled to continue to operate the way that he was. For him to speak with so much bluster about like his system and the fact that he felt like he was making premium calls, things like that, standing in front of a podium and essentially patting yourself on the back because you believe in your game plan is essentially pointing your fingers at the players, and you're above reproach. He made himself seem almost untouchable, almost up until the very end. He stood on that hill. And so, yeah, I think that there has to be a level of self-awareness that you have to have as a coach and understanding your team in order to put them in better positions. But you have to knock yourself down a couple pegs. If things aren't working consistently, then you have to make adjustments. Otherwise, what you're saying is that I'm smarter than all of you guys, which is where I think one of those quotes comes in, where someone said that he was too smart for his own good, that he seemed like he was the smartest guy in the room, and you guys need to catch up. But the flip side to that is what I mentioned before. It feels like he was enabled to do that, because if you got upper management that comes down and says, "Hey, Brandon, this isn't working. What kind of adjustments are we going to make?" It'd be really difficult for me to believe that he looked at them and says, "Well, what I'm doing is working perfectly fine. The guys just aren't performing well." And they were like, "Well, okay, Brandon, sorry, go ahead, do your thing." It just doesn't feel realistic. So I think there's a level of enabling and then a lack of self-awareness. And so the team suffered for it. And ultimately you see a difference, like you mentioned tonight. Guys were playing much more freely, faster. And no, it didn't result in the win, but you have to consider they played an extremely competitive game, missing multiple key players against a team that is in the playoff hunt. I don't think there's a coincidence there.
Yeah, and we talked about accountability and we talked about making adjustments, and I couldn't help but notice Derwin didn't play any deep safety tonight. He played almost the entire game in the slot. He was off the field in base defense. There were times where he was coming off the field on third down. That's a pretty big shift from how they've done things in the past. And you almost got to wonder how much of that was kind of well, we've had you doing so much and you're not doing any of it well. We kind of don't know what to do with you at this point. So we're going to have you play some slot and have you play around the line of scrimmage, and hopefully you make a couple plays for us. And I think that's important. And granted, Gift Smith's not going to be around very long, so it's not like that something that's going to continue. But I think that's got to be an important thing for some of the younger guys to see. Oh, Derwin's not playing well, and they're taking him off the field. I better get my shit together. Mm-hmm. So that kind of goes back to that accountability and professionalism thing of like, hey, if you're going to be a leader and you're going to talk, you got to walk the walk eventually, and you're not doing that right now. So let's simplify things for you. Let's get you off the field for a little bit, and let's, see if we can help you out and help the team out. So I was kind of encouraged by that, surprised by it, but encouraged by it. They simplified things for him and they got him off the field at times. And you didn't see as many of the mistakes as you have in the past.
And we were talking about this before, and Ainsley going to the defense and asking them what they wanted to do. Well, I also wonder how much of this has to do with the feedback that they got there, because even with Derwin playing more in the slot, I feel like there was more that they could have done with him within the box. I felt almost kind of sort of like they limited him in just the slot. I have to go back and double check. I'm not sure how many snaps he took, if he did at all, at like a dime or nickel linebacker inside of the box between the tackles. I'm not sure how much action he got there. For the most part, I saw him playing majority star. So, yeah, there was a definite difference in the way that they approach things. And the fact that Derwin seemed to kind of have had his role pared back a bit tells me that everyone else understood what worked for him and what didn't. But the head coach, the guy who ran the defense, for some reason had no idea, or he had these grandiose plans for a player to operate in a way that didn't fit his skill set. And he was just going to keep pounding that into the ground until, I guess, eventually it worked. He hadn't seen enough of it not be successful in order for him to make any changes, which is insane to me because we could all see it. But this just speaks to, again, lack of adaptability and self-awareness. And I guess for the remainder of the season, we're probably going to see a lot of what we saw tonight.
I think so. Well, I think we've had a pretty good show. We've covered a lot tonight. So let's just end with a quick question from Casey Linsmeyer. Casey says, what's your favorite Chargers related gift that you've received as a Christmas gift in the past?
My kids got me a Chargers coffee cup. I actually have a charge. Yeah, it's Chargers coffee cup, and I'm not sure where it is, which is sad. It's been a few weeks since I've seen it. I wouldn't be surprised if my wife took it to work or something. But yeah, that's been my favorite gift.
One year I got a Chargers cornhole set. The
Oh, I
boards
need one.
were
I need
the
one.
boards were painted in Chargers colors with the lightning bolt on it and the whole deal. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, wait. So I know we're wrapping up, but there's one thing that I think we discussed that we didn't get around to really quickly. Um, Talking about traits that we think need
Yes.
to be, yeah, the team needs going forward, whether we're talking leadership or like player personnel, just things that we think that they need to maybe add into the organization to take into a different direction. So, what do you think?
So we've hit on a lot of them. I think accountability is a big one. I think they need accountability in the front office. I think they need accountability with the head coach and with the players on the field. I think everybody needs to know when they need to be better. And right now, everybody needs to be better. So a lot more accountability. Um, we've talked about professionalism, doing your job, doing your homework, being prepared. Um, I think they need some cohesiveness. They need to bring the team together in the locker room and on the field. Um, and leadership is a big one. And these are all kind of, you know, um, they're concepts more so than traits, but
Mhm.
they need more players who are leaders on the field, and then they need a coach who can be the anchor for everything. And I think that's what they've been missing for the last 11 years is they just haven't had that, you know, gravitating force, that anchor to kind of hold them in place when things are starting to go bad, who can rally them and pull them out of those doldrums of bad plays and mistakes. They just haven't had that. And I think that's something that we're seeing that's really catching up to them. Um, what about you?
So, I'd say from a player standpoint, better self discipline. Just not only the work on the field and practice and putting it into the craft, but like prioritizing togetherness also. So just kind of understanding that this is a team game and there isn't a whole lot of room for separation. Um, but amongst themselves, like we mentioned before, understanding how important that is and making it a priority. Uh, then there's like sense of purpose. So like everyone on the same page, playing for one another, and just marching towards one common goal. Seems very basic, but I think it gets lost when you're talking about professional athletes who may be very selfish and looking to achieve their own personal goals. Collectively, there needs to be one sense of purpose. And then when we're talking like the coaching and front office, just actually mentioned this a couple minutes ago, self-awareness and adaptability. Know what
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work and don't be too stubborn to change just because your pride tells you what you know should work. Do what's best for the betterment of the team, and ultimately everyone succeeds, and then you succeed. So, by way of that, you look better. So it's not so much about you being the smartest guy in the room. It's about you knowing that if something doesn't work, it hasn't been as successful as you planned for it to be, then you have the self awareness to understand that maybe we have to make a change in order to get where we want to be. And maybe my original plan isn't going to work the way that I anticipated it. So those are the things that I think need to factor in to the organization moving forward. And again, I mean, we all know where they can probably find this type of leadership. And if the Chargers are going in the direction that they claim that they are, I mean, we made no bones about it. Jim Harbaugh is the person we think they can take that can take the team there. So hopefully that's the move that gets made. I think he can walk in the building day one and impart all of these things.
Yep, I think those are all really good. I would also add one that I forgot, which is mental toughness or resiliency, being able to bounce back through adversity, fight through adversity to come out on the other side. Um, I just think these teams have been soft and not just physically soft, although that is a problem, but mentally soft. They just don't know how to handle things when things start to go sideways.
Yeah.
And you kind of get that, here we go again feeling
Snowball. Yeah.
when things start to go sideways, and it just one thing becomes another and they can't dig themselves out of it. And they just need to figure out a way to work through that stuff and be tougher mentally and fight through it. And yeah, some physical toughness would help too, because this is not, they played a physical game tonight, but generally speaking, this is not a very physically tough group. They're not an overly physical group. And you'd like to see some of that added in the off season.
Agreed.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for joining us here. You guys are always here, win or lose, and we appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. I think we covered a lot tonight. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Everybody have a great holiday. Enjoy time with your family. Be safe, be healthy, and we will see you next time. So thank you.
Salute. Merry Christmas.